Liam, thanks for coming on.
No worries. Thanks
You've
for
got
having me.
more than 18 years of marketing experience. You're the Chief Marketing Officer of CloudTech Group, and you've been part of 3 IPOs. You've built several great marketing teams, as you mentioned, over your
Someone's
LinkedIn.
been reading my LinkedIn.
That's it.
Can you share the story of how you dove into the world of marketing and where that adventure has left you so far?
Yeah, I mean, weirdly enough, I went to China I always get this date wrong, but somewhere between 2002, 2004, doing postgrad. And I got over there and I started doing postgrad, and I realized there was only like 3 people I could actually talk about my subject with. Then SARS happened. I was in sort of the northeast, so all the universities closed. So I did a transfer to Shanghai University of Medicine.
The first SARS, right?
Sorry?
The first SARS?
The first SARS, yeah.
Yeah, got it, yep.
The killing one.
Hmm.
And then, different story maybe for another time, but I did get SARS. I have an official Chinese Ministry of Health medical record.
Wow. That's nice.
Yeah, so I moved to Shanghai. Then I sort of got into a business deal with these guys about setting up kind of a clinic. Originally, I was kind of the boss and they were the funders. But as often happens in the startup space, slowly the investors just pushed more and more of what they wanted to do. So after about a year of being kind of frustrated, I just took a job working for a tech company, sort of a financial services company. Started off as like a marketing manager, because after 9 years at uni, I can write 1,500 words on command about anything. So that's where it started, and then slowly just climbed up. Promotion. First company I worked for is called DST. They're like a really large financial services company selling software as a service. So that kind of got me into tech. Couple of jumps, I went through the whole thing, but I moved to Hong Kong after about 10 years. Worked for a company called World First, who did cross-border payments. Their core focus was e-commerce. So at that stage, that was when Amazon listed Chinese manufacturers. So you could sell yourself rather than have a middleman. So the flow was huge. It was like $40 billion in like 18 months. So it's a very small profit on a very large flow. So Alibaba acquired them because obviously Alibaba wants to own the whole vertical, right? Payments and everything. So that was kind of my first exit and understanding of how exits worked. I didn't really make that much money at all. But then from there, I went into a company called ANX, which is now called BC Group and is listed. We did an ICO that was like 2018 bull market. So I just like walked in the door, didn't really understand crypto. And they're like, oh, we're doing an ICO. You're running the marketing team, sort that stuff out. So it was like literally learning on the fly. I think I didn't sleep before like 2-3 o'clock in the morning for about 3 months. But in retrospect, it is one of the most, it's one of the things in my career I'm most proud of. Then I got recruited out of there to work for a company called Diginex, which went from startup to listed on the NASDAQ in about 2 years, 3 months, which is not the fastest ever, but it's pretty fast. And I had hair before that and I didn't have hair after. So that might have contributed to that. I did travel a lot during that period of time as well. I worked out for like a 1 year period. I was traveling between 55 and 60% of the time. So if you like that glamorous lifestyle and you like being in Holiday Inn Expresses in Berlin and stuff like that, I highly recommend it. And then I moved back to Australia beginning of COVID. My father had a family health issue. So then I came back. I worked for a company called Banksa. I joined them 3 months before they IPO'd on the Toronto Venture Stock Exchange. So Dom, the founder, is really, really good talking to investors. But like a lot of those entrepreneurial guys, his back-end kind of operational organisation isn't great. So my job was to kind of, everyone we met, let's put them in a spreadsheet. Let's make sure we're reaching out to them. Yeah. So it was kind of a grind, as raising capital always is. And then I was at Banksa for about 18 months. And then I jumped out, did some consulting, and then I started at CloudTech 8-9 months ago. Yeah.
Wow. Quite the story. Quite the resume. That's for damn sure. So thanks for breaking that down for us. So a lot to break down here. Let's talk, early days in your career. You kind of saw yourself as, in the marketing industry. When you started out and you started building relationships with people and you went into your first venture, what was the strategy? What actually do you think, what skills do you think you had that allowed you to stand out in the crowd?
It's hard to classify that stuff exactly because it really depends when you get on the train. So if you're a founder, it's a very different skill set than what I do. At ANX, I was literally in a room with a windowless room when I first joined, with 2 guys who at that stage were a company called OSL. There was literally 2 guys. OSL's now like one of the biggest crypto OTC desks in Asia. They just took money from BitGet. They've taken money from Fidelity. So, you know, that's the growth track. That was 2 guys in a windowless office, and now they've probably got 70, 80 people. They've just taken a pretty big investment. I think the core skills are being really comfortable with uncertainty, because most places I walk in, they have no structure, right? They kind of have a guy who does social media. He's maybe working to a content calendar, but there's no operational process. So one of the things I do is I do the strategic vision part, like where are we trying to get to? How much is that going to cost to get where we want to get to? But also actually build out the process. So I think being uncomfortable with uncertainty, I've always had a philosophy with my network that actually I try not to meet people with an agenda. I try to just meet people and then have a chat with them. Maybe it's at a conference, maybe it's, you know, in a lobby of a venture capital, and then just keep in contact with them, right? Every couple of weeks, a couple of months, just hit them up on Telegram or via email, and eventually they will mature. You can't always see the return on investment on some of those relationships, but cultivate them all, right? I think that's a critical skill. That'd be the 2, I think. Thick skin is quite useful. Very clear boundaries on what your work-life balance is. That'd be the 4 skills I think were most important.
Interesting. Sure.
In a lot of the companies that you've mentioned, there's a bit of a sort of fintech, crypto, blockchain focus. What do you think has, I guess, pulled you towards that industry and being, I guess, a salesman and a marketing officer for all these companies? Why not healthcare or something else?
Weirdly enough, that's the industry I was in when I was doing postgrad. I mean, I worked in tech before. First, it was really large listed financial services companies. Then it was sort of smaller startups. World First was like 10 years old, I think, when I joined. But that e-commerce piece was like, that was their growth business. I've gone through a few cycles. Like, I'm quite idealistic about actual blockchain technology, but I fully acknowledge that there's a reasonable number of scammers in the space, and a lot of people aren't really building anything useful. They're like a problem looking for a solution. So I've probably been super idealistic and then gone and become quite pessimistic, and now I'm somewhere in the middle, maybe a realist.
So you mentioned you started CloudTech Group. Who did you start it with?
No, I didn't start it. I joined pretty much early on. So the company was launched in Dubai originally.
Okay.
But there's 2 separate entities. The Australian entity launched 2020 and 2021. Our founder is a Chinese guy, Kevin Chen. Our CEO is another guy, also called Kevin, just to confuse you, Kevin He. And then we have, when I joined, we had like 3 products, and now we have sort of 6. 3 of those are essentially still startup phase, no funding or seed funding only, building out the plan and building out the MVP. So it's kind of challenging because I've got to prioritize my time, obviously, on what generates revenue, because ultimately, if you're looking for investment, that's the thing that intelligent investors will look for. But then you've also got these small projects that require a bunch of your time, even though you can't see the immediate return. And, you know, if your boss tells you to do something, you kind of got to do it. But you've also, in your own head, got to be able to have a really clear understanding of how to prioritize your time.
Right.
If you had to sort of break down for our viewers what exactly it is that you do at CloudTech Group, you know, what is the agenda that you're working towards? What are your key performance indicators and metrics?
I think as well, like, what does CloudTech actually do?
Yeah, because
Sure.
I couldn't find that on the website.
So CloudTech is essentially, it's a holding company, right? If you look at the website, it's kind of generic blockchain stuff. It talks about investment. It talks about development. So we have all those things. We have a development team who can build on Ethereum or build on other blockchains. They're pretty accomplished coders, full stack, back end, all that sort of stuff. Then under CloudTech Group, we have CloudTech X, which is a licensed payments company here in Australia. They have an app called Cobweb Pay, which the whole value proposition of Cobweb Pay is we just looked at if you spend $100 to buy Bitcoin on any of the on-ramps in Australia, you get hosed. You get really bad. The fees are really high. We were looking at our competitors yesterday. For $100, you got like 64 Tether, so 64 US dollars. Our competitors were paying 55. So that's a value proposition. It's a non-custodial wallet. You can easily link your bank account, buy Bitcoin, buy Ethereum, buy Tether, and you could transfer them to an exchange. It's just a really cheap way to get in. You know, the Bitcoin white paper talks about rent seekers. which is probably an industry term, so I'll explain it. It's essentially middlemen, right? They're not building anything. They're just taking a clip for being in the middle. And that's kind of what all those fiat on-ramp services are, right? They're just middlemen. So that's, then we have a VC, which is in launch phase at the moment. Then we have half a dozen other blockchain projects. So it's complicated to describe. We look for opportunities. We look for potential investment. On the financial services side, we have a really strong kind of executive team. We have Mandy Jung, who is one of the founders of Judo Bank. Mandy's core focus is really investor capital raising. Judo was the largest ever IPO in Australia at 1.8 billion. And largely, Mandy was responsible for that. Then we have Rob Wall, who's just joined us from NAB. He built out the stablecoin project for NAB. There's always a challenge with banks because banks traditionally are terrible with technology, right? A few of the big banks in Australia are still using software on their back end that was coded in the 70s because actually replacing that takes ages, and so they don't. If it works, it works, but that makes it hard to integrate with new systems. So NAB has a stablecoin. They've done a few cross-border transactions. Just for anyone who doesn't understand, a stablecoin is like a digital asset that is pegged to the value of something, so a US dollar or an Australian dollar. So it's not volatile.
So does that mean it's a one-to-one? So for every...
More or less, it's supposed to be a one-to-one. All of the stable coins have a slightly different way that they do that custody, right? Some actually might hold US dollars in a US dollar custody, or some of them might 30% might be held in crypto and the rest held in dollars. But yeah, essentially it should be pegged one-to-one, and they should at any time be able to produce where those funds are.
Interesting.
For a lot of our audience, I think even myself included, who grew up with excitement around cryptocurrency and blockchain and then became somewhat jaded after they've seen recent developments of FTX and even Binance and even like some of the stable coins not really being as stable as they first as we
algorithmic
first
stable coins.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How does one go about reconciling all these failures with true projects that are based on real technology and
utility?
They're rooted in utility.
For my sins, when I was at a company called DigiNex, because I was at a lot of conferences and traveling and kind of working with potential companies, invested companies, that sort of stuff. In that 2.5 year period, I probably read 130 to 150 white papers because I would be at a conference. So everyone who was looking for funding, like we were covered in the South China Morning Post, having sold our crypto mining business for $80 million. So we pushed that out because that's good for us. But actually, most of those deals are not $80 million in cash. It's like an equity swap and $40 million in cash. But a bunch of startups were just looking for money. So I was the first port of call. They would go, hey, then I would read the white paper. If I thought it was good, I would hand it up to the investment committee. So by virtue of reading those, my ability to detect bullshit has got pretty good. Generally, I think the industry as a whole, it's why regulation is really the only way forward. The industry as a whole has not effectively policed itself, right? My example of that would be the AMA in Australia, the Australian Medical Association. Love them or hate them, they do represent their members very effectively. And if a doctor starts to get flagged for like complaints, the AMA is usually 50% of the time faster than like any criminal or civil charges, right? They'll be like, we're going to suspend this guy's license. The crypto peak bodies are not quite there, right? So in a couple of cases, there's been peak bodies that have, had members in good standing who were kind of known to be doing wash trading or, bending the rules. So that'd be that. The first part of your question was kind of, how do you reconcile with scams? I've been really lucky in my career. I've worked at 3 or 4 companies that had really strong developers, and I was really lucky at ANX. Hugh Madden, who's the CTO, is just like a really amazing technologist. When I was at DigiNex, I sat next to Jose Perez, who's a really great developer. He was the head of innovation because he doesn't like anything commercial. He just likes to build stuff. And I could always turn around and say, I don't actually understand. Explain to me like I'm a 5-year-old what layer 2 is. So what I realized is if people aren't actually building like an actual product or an MVP, then essentially they're just marketing in this space. Red flags would be their idea is revolutionary, like Uber on blockchain. Okay, explain to me how that is better than the current Uber we have. You could potentially build an Uber on blockchain, but you'd have to spend a lot of time, how the transactions work, all that sort of stuff. Just saying Uber on blockchain doesn't really solve anyone's problems. Most people don't actually care. Can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
go for it.
They don't give a shit that it's blockchain or not blockchain, right? What they care about is a really seamless user experience. That's why Uber works. You link your credit card, you call, it's better if the car turns up in 2 minutes rather than 9 minutes, which is just what happened to me. But, ultimately it's seamless. You get in, you get out, you don't even really feel like you've paid, right? That is what people want.
Yep.
Crypto is still challenging because if you use a Trezor, or today there's been a hack on Ledger, which is the other hardware wallet, ultimately, if you forget your password, you've got to remember a seed phrase, which is 20 or 25 characters, words, right? So you write that down. I literally have books on my bookcases at home. I write the seed phrases for various hardware wallets in the books. You could open 10 books easily in my house and they have seed phrases. And every now and then, if I've got to reset something, I have to remember which one goes with which one.
So where do you live?
You assume there's any actual money in those accounts. No. Essentially what I'm saying, blockchain is always going to have problems to go fully mass market until we solve that problem. And the way I think about it is, I set my mum up with $100 of Ethereum because she wanted to buy a bunch of Bitcoin. And I was like, here is your little kiddie pool. Let's see how you do. Within 2 weeks, you can remember the password, right? Imagine there was $35,000 on there. Until there's such a way that my mum can easily access that, make that mistake, speak to customer service or whatever, we're never going to go mass market.
Yeah.
So that's what a lot of the people who are building seem to be doing. If you look at Fireblocks, I don't know how familiar you are with the space. Fireblocks is a really kind of growing company. They've got really big revenue and a lot of cash. But essentially, they are just building like adult in the room kind of custody solutions. How are you holding the crypto, right? All those types of things. And they work with like a lot of the banks in Australia, a lot of banks in the US. They just built one product, got very good at that product, and then slowly came out with more offerings. And if I had to look for kind of an overarching theme in startups, more often than not, that works better than the let's try 20 things at once. Just build your first product. You will learn a lot of lessons doing that. Resourcing, treasury management, MVPs, developers versus sales guys versus product managers. And then once that product gets pretty good, the institutional knowledge that you build up doing that, it's very easy to just build a second product, right? But if you try and build 10 products at the same time, you're essentially dividing your attention and your resources. So those would be the things I look for. If they've got grandiose claims, if they're trying to build too many things at once, if they talk a great game but you can't actually really understand the product or what the value add is, those would be all red flags to me.
Liam, I'm still a little bit, I suppose, confused about the utility of the whole thing. Because in my mind, and I feel there might be a lot of people who agree, they see a lot of cash being transferred between here and there, and there's a lot of exchanges and a lot of money on the table and such. But when you say build things on the blockchain, what does that mean?
Okay, let's go back to first principles. What is the point of Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Nearly instantaneous value transmission anywhere in the world within 15 or 30 minutes with no middleman, right? If you send money overseas with Commonwealth Bank, guaranteed at the moment, unless you're a huge customer with a lot of funds on hand, you send money to Singapore, they settle in what's called T+1, which is transaction plus one. So that's tomorrow. Why in 2023 are the banks still settling? I mean, NAB knows that DBS is a legitimate player. DBS knows that NAB is a legitimate player. So it's not like one of them's going to run away, right? But their systems batch transactions and they do it twice a day. So that's why. There's no reason they do that. That's just legacy technology. So Bitcoin was built for a very specific purpose. Transferring value without a middleman, so without a bank. It's trustless to a certain extent. It's also censorship resistant, but we don't need to talk about that right now. But value transmission anywhere in the world, very, very effectively. Bitcoin does that amazingly well. So let's look at an example. Blockchain is essentially a decentralized ledger. What does that mean? Essentially, a ledger is like a spreadsheet, right? Your bank has a ledger, but that's a centralized ledger. Your bank has a line item in its Excel spreadsheet that has Benjamin's balance, right? They could take $6 out for fees, right? You're not really 100% sure what those fees are for. Maybe you ring them up and you ask, not to say it's your monthly account fee or whatever. They can manipulate that ledger however they like. A decentralized ledger cannot be manipulated by anyone, right? Once it's in the ledger, so it's distributed across all the computers on the network, it's immutable, can't be changed. So if you look at, say, the New York Stock Exchange, one of the things that there's always been a lot of conversations about is, if people build bigger networking, bigger sort of server centers on the bigger backbone of like different cables, they might get a fractional advantage over others, right? So they could get their trades in, even though they technically made the trade order later, they might get it in earlier because they've got better tech. Blockchain would solve all that problem if you put the whole New York Stock Exchange, because the transactions are all signed when they happen, right? Certain times. So that would actually make stock markets more transparent. It would make banking more transparent. And obviously banks don't like that because A, they're not great with new technology. B, they're quite comfortable making the money they're making. And C, they don't really want to upgrade those processes.
But realistically, like, what are the supposed risks of converting the entire stock exchange to a blockchain technology?
It's untested at that level of scale with that much money behind it. So actually the ASX, there was a company out in New York, I don't know if they're still around, called Digital Asset. Say 2019, 2020, they were really popular. They had a lot of like capital markets people and venture cap people and investment bankers, and they were building blockchain tech for financial services. The ASX launched a pilot program with them. This is back 2018, 2019, when Australia was fairly forward thinking on crypto regulation. Yeah. So they built a pilot program. Hong Kong Stock Exchange did the same. Both of those projects just sort of failed. But, the ASX didn't say it failed. It just slowly wrapped it up and put it away. And the reason is you're dealing with people's superannuation, their share portfolios. At scale, that's where blockchain can have lag. Right, so you can have a certain number of network transactions on the network in a second. That's TPS is something that a lot of blockchains talk about. But ultimately, think about even the Australian Stock Exchange. How many buy and sell orders, right? You're dealing with people's retirement. So if one transaction goes wrong, potentially that's one superannuation fund. So it's technically 10,000 people's accounts. How would you unwind that trade, right? I think that's the main obstacle that they face to do that, right? A lot of these blockchain solutions haven't been tested at scale. Now that the market's maturing, there are. So Fireblocks would definitely have tested their things. Ledger, up till today, was pretty robust across a lot of networks. Ripple works really well. Solana works pretty well. Hedera Hashgraph, they can do a lot of transactions. I think the problem is the market is still quite fragmented. If you look at, say, the Australian banking market, there's maybe 6 banks with a lot of branches, and then you could add 20 more, which would be like ICBC, Bank of China, Merrill Lynch. They would probably have 1 or 2 branches. But maybe there's 50 real banks in Australia. But the top 4 own 85% of the market. That allows them to operate with economies of scale, right? No small bank is ever going to be able to beat them on fees until they have as much money under their control as the NAB, right? That's why we launched all these neobanks in Australia 4 or 5 years ago, and I think there's 1 left because fundamentally they can't compete. Crypto probably needs that to a certain extent. Coinbase probably dominates the US, especially now that Binance has problems. Binance was dominating the world. They got a $4 billion fine, but I don't actually think that's going to derail them, how much money they got on hand. If you go back a few years, EOS was a really hyped project, which just when I heard about was like, yeah, I don't really think it's going to live up to the hype. But they raised $4 billion. They got dinged by the SEC, and I think the total fine was 120. So make $4 billion, pay 120, still worth it, right? BitMEX is the same. So if you sit at that real, one of my old bosses explained it best. In an uncertain regulatory environment, you don't have to be the whitest fish. You just definitely don't want to be the blackest fish. As long as you're making best efforts to comply with where you think the regulation is going, that's maybe the best you can do, right, in an uncertain environment.
Okay. I think I'm curious as an individual about the future of blockchain and the future of cryptocurrency. In fact, if there was a crypto that I could use for my general transactions, I would. But there seems to be no easy option. If I could log on to my Up account and deposit my money and pay with crypto, I probably would, because I don't want the government involved in my finances. But there is no easily accessible option. Everything I've seen out there is apps that you can kind of buy crypto with and then store it, or you can get your own ledger and store it on your own device. So what is needed before cryptocurrency becomes mainstream? What is the barrier that's stopping an app like Up being created except for cryptocurrency?
I think you need to reframe your position, because when you pay bank fees, essentially you're outsourcing your control of your money to a certain extent, right? Your bank will count up interest payments and all that sort of stuff. Crypto traditionally, from a philosophical perspective, is like empowering you. You don't have to pay anyone any middle management fees, but you have to maintain your own security. So like, probably don't leave your crypto once you get past a couple of $1,000s on a centralized exchange, because if that gets hacked, maybe you get your money back, maybe you don't. Mm-hmm. If you have a hardware wallet at home, air-gapped computer, a lot of guys who have got reasonable funds do, so they just have a laptop that is literally never touched the internet. So you're empowering yourself, but empowering yourself is hard, right? Being an active member of like the democracy in Australia and actually reading all the articles and understanding all the parties' positions is hard. That's why most people don't do it. I think the big gap is a lot of the developers who have been in blockchain a long time, they are quite used to like the difficulty, seed phrases, security, remembering all that sort of stuff. So they're like, this product works amazingly well, but they don't necessarily think about the UX, UI, the user experience part. That's getting better. But I think ultimately, I don't believe that the traditional finance world and the decentralized finance or the crypto finance world, I don't think they're different. I think the future is, it just becomes an asset class, because, there's always been this thing in crypto where we kind of worship founders like gods, right? Probably comes from Bitcoin, because Satoshi Nakamoto, who wrote the Bitcoin white paper, is anonymous. Then for Ethereum, you have Vitalik and Joe Lublin, CZ, Binance, right? Then you've got Justin Sun, Tron. There's a lot of these founders. And like, a lot of them are really intelligent. But to think a 19-year-old coder understands the financial markets better than some guy who's top tier in the world, who's been in it for 40 years, is just naive and a bit stupid. So bankers maybe don't understand the technology, but they understand interest, they understand back office investment accounting, they understand, risk and compliance. So ultimately, I think it goes mass market when you can log onto your Hester account, your super account, and you can, how sometimes you can click how aggressive you want your portfolio. Yeah. So I think they'll just be like, how much exposure do you want to crypto? 5%, right? Mm-hmm. Once the ETFs go in the US, there'll be ETF access here. So people will be actually able to choose to put their money in. I think that's where we get to mass market.
Also, Combank has an ETF already, did they not?
So kind of yes, but no, right? Is that the right? I'm not 100% across the Combank one. So, but essentially everyone in the US is looking to BlackRock. Because if BlackRock goes, that's what, 250 million people's 401ks. Yeah. The volume there is crazy. I'm not entirely sure about the Combank ETF, because the Combank is still pretty much in line with most of the other banks in Australia and is debanking crypto companies at a fairly regular rate.
Well, that's what I mean, right? So you've got banks that seem to be transitioning, creating investment portfolios for people to invest in crypto. But then also decentralized currency is almost like anti-bank and regulation. So how do they fit together?
Do you want to go on a really weird historical
tangent? Let's go.
Okay. Why are countries the only forces that produce money and have armies? Because in 1648, at the end of the 30 Years' War, which was a 30-year war between Catholics and Protestants all across Europe, it was the worst war until World War I. There was a lot of guys who were really good generals. So they work for, say, the Germans, and they win a few battles, and then their soldiers go, I don't want to work for some other general because they kill their troops. I want to stay with this guy. So that guy gets hired by the enemy, so his whole army would just change. So he was a private individual with an army. At the end of the war, they were like, this is one of the main reasons there was a problem, because these dudes would just change, they would fight, didn't get paid, they would set their own town on fire. Ultimately, that's the only reason that countries control currency. If you think about it, you take a step back, surely a single world currency is not a bad idea, right? You could buy stuff from China. I'm not talking about some big brother type thing, but some kind of decentralized exchange where there's a universal currency that we can all kind of work in, we can all kind of access. A lot of blockchain projects talk about banking the debank. It's a little bit of like an ESG term. It's a good idea, but a lot of companies are not necessarily executing at the level that they talk that they are. But essentially, there's a lot of people in Africa and Asia who don't have access to bank accounts, right? That's crazy in 2023. Blockchain can solve that relatively well. You can get a wallet on your phone, do credit transfers from your prepaid phone. That stuff, there's a huge opportunity for. Some projects are doing okay. There's not really a winner there. But ultimately, I think blockchain and crypto will just become part of the financial network, right? Slowly, as those companies become more successful, banks will buy them because they'll just want that technology.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly enough, on the topic of history, you've got politicians these days and, political parties of entire countries coming together and collaborating to create, digital currencies, for example, that seem to be in an attempt to overthrow the US dollar.
I think we're talking about China. I mean, let's focus on China.
Well, they are one of many, right?
And BRICS.
Well, they've probably got their
BRICS
CBDC, their central bank digital currency, is probably a little bit further along than most others.
Yeah.
China banned crypto.
Yeah.
The reason is China is really scared, shit scared actually, of all of their population who's now middle class or upper middle class moving their money offshore. Because the stock market in China, I lived in China for a long time, so I feel that I'm capable of commenting on this to a certain extent. The stock market in China either goes up all the time or it drops precipitously, right? Most people think that there's a little bit of manipulation there, but I'm not going to say that. That's allegedly. But if you have a reasonable amount of money, what do? You buy houses. People in China own many, many houses that probably people in Australia don't understand, right? Like if you have extra money, you just buy a house. You don't put tenants in it. Chinese people don't really like tenants in their houses. They will put them in if it's like a cost thing, but usually they don't. And then if someone gets sick, they just sell one of the houses. That's how they access cash. If crypto is still around in China, I mean, people can still do it. There's ways around it, but a lot of people would be offshoring their money, right? So China bans cryptocurrencies, and then it releases its own cryptocurrency. What it's trying to do is actually capture what percentage of the market still remains and pretend it's kind of forward thinking. This is kind of a great myth. Drug dealers don't buy Bitcoin. Drug dealers like cash, because cash, no one can trace it, right? The only time you might get caught is when you try and put it in a bank, right? Crypto, from the moment a Bitcoin is mined till the day till forever, every transaction can be mapped. The Australian Federal Police and a bunch of other guys, the FBI, they use products called elliptic or chain analysis. They can track a Bitcoin transaction through 50 different wallets, right? Even if you divide it up and send it to 10 different wallets, they can track all that. So this is what the exchanges use. If one of your wallets has been involved with gambling or dark web, they will flag you as maybe amber, right? You've got an amber flag. That, in some jurisdictions, that's like gambling, that's high risk and people can't touch you. Some of the exchanges have different appetites for risk, but Bitcoin does not disappear. Every transaction is immutably written on the blockchain. So yeah, you can move it around. As the different governments kind of understand the market better, I don't think you can really hide it.
But if you move Bitcoin around, you don't know who owns it. Is that right?
No, but you know the wallet that it's in. So there's this wallet. This is the public keys for that wallet, and you can see the balance in the wallet. You don't know who can own it, but you can see it every time it moves. So you might be able to find out roughly where that wallet is, right? Because it logs on somewhere, something like that. You see a transaction. And you can't actually ever get the cash out. You can put it into an exchange. Once it goes into an exchange, a centralized exchange especially, that, it gets a little bit hard. That's essentially going into a washing machine, right? Yeah. But a compliant exchange would track that money coming in and they would be able to report it going out. And so if they were, in touch with law enforcement, they would they would probably get a request and they would say it went to these wallets. The one challenge is if I steal Bitcoin from you and I go on exchange and I sell it for stable coins, it's very challenging for me to go to the person that I sold it to and ask for it back. So to a certain extent, if the guy has collected it and moved it on, that's hard. But you can track the transactions easier than you can track bags of cash. There's a reason that the biggest fraud and money laundering is not like crypto. It's HSBC and Deutsche Bank and those guys, right?
And it seems sometimes that governments use this sort of allure of crime and this sort of money laundering to, I guess, put their own agendas on cryptocurrency, whether that's sort of increasing regulation or banning it, without recognizing that, the majority of money laundering, the majority of crime happens with real cash in traditionally well-known and regulated banks. I think everything at the moment is a little bit not optimal, right? So that there's a lot that can be done in the crypto world that isn't being done.
That's an underlying principle of the world, Ben. The world is by nature suboptimal.
But you said in the past that you're hopelessly optimistic about blockchain technology.
I used to be hopeless. Now I'm just optimistic.
What are you optimistic about? What do you think the future holds? Like not just in terms of it becomes an asset class, but how will it be involved in our day-to-day lives?
So a lot of the things that have happened in crypto are like crap, right? NFTs. Everyone was like, oh, buy Bored Ape, it's $30,000, and now 99% of that market value has been wiped out. But what is a legitimate case for an NFT? Okay, so I could produce a book, put it on Amazon. Now, I don't really like it if you copy the book as an EPUB file and give it to Oliver, right? Because technically you're stealing my money. But if I issued a digital NFT, essentially a digital certificate of authenticity, if you wanted Oliver to read the book, you could transfer that license to him for 2 weeks, right? So he reads the book, it's licensed, then he gives it back to you. You can use that as a certificate of authenticity for, artworks. So I think NFTs actually have a perfectly good use case. We just haven't done it because the scamming, like, let's make 10 times our money, has happened. Immutability on ledgers has a lot of applications, right? One of the areas that people have been looking at, security tokens, which are essentially equities, but blockchain-backed equities. Why is that good? So the settlement issue I talked before, you can't rearrange trades in the order you want, but you can fractionally own a house, right? There hasn't been a huge amount of like fully real-world recognized use cases, but there was one in New York where they fractionally owned like an apartment building, so you could put your 50 grand in if that's all you had, and you owned a piece of that building. Now, you could do that through what's called a REIT, which is a real estate trust, but settlement on those things can take a couple of days. If it's all crypto-backed, it can happen almost instantaneously. So I think the technology, immutability, decentralization, I think fundamentally they are quite good. If you look at the web, right, this is a tangent, but I'll bring it back and land the plane. Web 1 was MSN, Yahoo. Like you logged on, you saw some semblance of the news reflected on your homepage. Then we got to Web 2, which is kind of where we are now, which is the walled garden model, right? Facebook is actually incentivized to keep you on their platform as long as possible because then they get to serve you more ads. So they have a bunch of PhDs sitting in a room that understand psychology, and they're just literally coming up with ways to make all the little notifications, everything, give you a dopamine hit to stay on the platform longer. The next piece we're going to is Web 3, and that's where hopefully people begin to take back some ownership, right? You're giving all this data for free to Google. There's a bunch of blockchain projects that say, let's actually, if people are going to use that data, it has value. And if it has value and it's your data, you should earn some amount on it, right? None of them are deployed at scale, but I think that's a noble pursuit, right? Turns us from being factory farmed data machines into being slightly more autonomous. So that's what Web3. And Web3 doesn't really work without blockchain and a couple of other sort of technology pieces in it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
I know that we are running out of time here, so
Yeah.
I think we'll have to quickly wrap things up. But I thought we'd do a quick fire round.
I mean, this is fun.
We'll do a quick fire round.
Yeah, we can do a quick fire round.
So we're going to present you with a series of AI-generated questions that you're going to have to answer with whatever comes to your mind first off the bat. Try not to filter. So,
have you not noticed I don't have much of a filter?
If you could visit any place in the world, where would it be and why?
Either the First Crusade before it got to Jerusalem, because my favorite historical character of all time was involved in that, or ancient Rome at some point. I'm not exactly sure where. I just would kind of like to see how guys with swords and horses dominated like all of Europe.
So the middle, not the decline or the rise.
Like Augustus, this period, like right after Julius Caesar. I'd probably want to be on Augustus's side rather than Mark Antony's side. But, I think that'd be pretty cool. Yeah, that'd be all right.
Nice.
Except if you got like a splinter and got infection or something. That would be bad. But yeah, I mean, probably one of those two.
Interesting. So if you could be a fly on a wall in any company in the world, which would it be?
Ooh. Any time period or right now?
Any time period, let's just say that.
Just because I have a vicious sense of humor, I would like to be a fly on the wall of Enron right before they had to announce how screwed they were, right? Because those guys were like full-on alpha males in their heads, and like just to realize that it was totally out of control and it was all a scam. I think that would have been an amazing 3 hours in a conference room.
What's a unique or quirky habit that your friends or family often tease you about?
I'm a super uber nerd. So outside of work, I play like tabletop RPGs. Dungeons and Dragons. I'm technically trying to turn it into a side hustle, so I'm starting to like post online. So I like paint miniatures and stuff. So my friends who play, they still give me a hard time. They're like, "You're such a geek," and people who don't play, they're like, "You're such a geek."
I mean, I was in the city the other day with my partner, just walking around, and we walked down this staircase, and there was a D&D like kind of session going on somewhere in a dark corner underground. And I have to say, I walked in there, I was like, "Wow. This is exactly what I thought it would be like."
It's gotten crazy popular since COVID, right? Because we're all locked down. Doing it online, like it doesn't cost any money. One of you just got to have a vague imagination. It's collaborative. It's social. So yeah, it's taken off. So there's a lot of people on YouTube. Critical Role is a big one, and Dropout TV. Like they get 350,000 views like a week.
Yeah.
Right. So it's actually turned into a sort of a financially profitable approach, which is
right.
cool.
We'll leave you with one last question, not a quick fire round, more of a reflection question. What's your mental model? Like, what is the mechanism that you use to make decisions and provide direction in terms of, building the legacy that you want to create?
I used to use a lot of like work priority templates and stuff. There's one called the Eisenhower method, which is you divide everything into like 4 things. Lots of people would know this, but maybe they don't know it as the Eisenhower method. Is it time sensitive and important, right? Then that's what you focus on. If it's time sensitive but not important, delegate. So I used to use a lot of those. As I've got, your career, you go through different phases. I like to think of my career kind of looks metaphorically like an hourglass. When you're at the beginning, you're a generalist. Your boss goes, "Get me a coffee, write this, build a slide deck." So you generally tend to be quite good. Once you're 5 to 8 years in, you tend to specialize. You're a digital marketing manager, a comms person. Once you get to a senior level, you have to be a bit of a generalist because you're managing all those people. So I've got less into using those kind of matrices and lenses to look at the world, and I just go back to my intuition, right? I can feel when a project is starting to the wheels are starting to come off. Just by talking to the people who are working on it, right? If they've got a sense of ownership and they're really concise, I feel confident. If they're sort of wishy-washy, so I tend to really use my gut, right? I can sort of feel where something's going wrong. Also, last sort of 5 years, I've gotten the ability for me to disconnect from my ego has got much better. And, if your ego's involved, you get defensive when you take criticism. I'm usually all right with that these days. So I think that's pretty important. You can't really learn if your ego's in the way, right? You have to be humble. Then sort of trusting your gut. Your gut can have shit for brains, but over time, your gut actually should get pretty good at giving you an indication of, is this like legit? Is this going well? Am I talking to these guys and they're telling me what I want to hear, but they're sweating and nervous? And like when I ask to see the MVP, they're wishy-washy. So like you can just start to get a feel for these things, I think.
That's great. I think that's something to wrap up on, something to reflect on.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Wish we had more time, but yeah, Liam.
Yeah, it's a quick fire round.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much.